In 1945, Tokyo was broken. Bombed-out buildings, shattered infrastructure, a defeated nation trying to remember who it was. Japan wasn't just rebuilding its cities, it was rebuilding its sense of purpose and dignity. Inside a partially destroyed department store, two men began repairing radios. Not as a grand business plan, but as a way forward in a country that had lost almost everything. What they were really repairing was confidence, the belief that Japan could once again make things the world would respect. Masaru Ibuka was an engineer, quiet, precise, obsessed with craftsmanship and continuous improvement. Akio Morita was a physicist, but also a philosopher at heart, with an instinct for people, stories, and culture. Together, they believed technology could be a bridge between post-war survival and a more human future. They didn't want to build weapons. They didn't want to build massive factories. They wanted to build things people could trust, things people could feel proud to own and proud to use in public. They named their company Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo. Later, they shortened it to something the world could pronounce: Sony. From the very beginning, Sony believed something radical for its time. Technology should not feel industrial or intimidating. It should feel human. It should feel personal. That belief became the quiet backbone of everything they built, even when the company later grew too large to remember why. Their early breakthroughs were modest but meaningful. They took the transistor, dismissed in the United States as a novelty, and turned it into something portable and reliable. Music left the living room and followed people into the street. Radios became companions, not furniture. Then came televisions. Then color televisions. Each step wasn't about domination, but refinement, making technology smaller, lighter, more elegant, and closer to everyday life. In 1968, Sony released the Trinitron. It was expensive, it was risky, and it was beautiful. It delivered a picture people hadn't seen before, sharper and richer than competitors. Stores used it as a reference point, placing other televisions next to it and letting the difference speak for itself. Sony wasn't competing on price, they were competing on taste. Akio Morita believed people didn't buy specifications, they bought experiences, even if they couldn't fully explain why one product felt better than another. Then, in 1979, Sony released a strange little device. No speakers, no recording function, just headphones and music. Executives inside Sony hated it. Market research said it would fail. People wouldn't want music they couldn't share. Morita ignored them. He believed intuition mattered more than surveys, especially when people couldn't yet imagine what they were missing. They called it the Walkman. With that decision, Sony didn't just launch a product, they changed human behavior. Music became private, portable, identity-shaping. People walk through cities physically present, but mentally elsewhere. Jogging, commuting, studying, daydreaming, all suddenly had a soundtrack. The Walkman quietly reshaped how people experience public space and inner life. It created a new kind of solitude inside crowds. For the first time, technology didn't just do something useful, it felt intimate. This was emotional technology, decades before Apple would build an empire around the same idea. With the Walkman, Sony did something few companies ever achieve. It didn't just create a successful product category, it created a new social norm. Silence in public became acceptable. Headphones became a signal. Don't interrupt, I'm elsewhere. The world became louder, but people felt more inward. This invisible cultural shift would later become the foundation for smartphones, podcasts, and always-on media, all built on a behavior Sony introduced without fully realizing its long-term consequences. By the 1980s and 90s, Sony wasn't just successful, it was everywhere. Sony televisions, Sony cameras, Sony stereos, Sony music, Sony pictures, and eventually, Sony PlayStation. Sony owned hardware, Sony owned content, Sony owned culture. It shaped what people watched, listened to, and played. For a while, it felt as if Sony wasn't reacting to culture, but actively steering it. From the outside, Sony looked unstoppable, like a company that had permanently solved consumer technology. From the inside, something dangerous was happening. Success had created size. Size had created distance. The future was changing shape. It wasn't arriving as a single breakthrough device. It was arriving quietly, as software, as files instead of disks, as ecosystems instead of standalone products. And Sony's greatest strength, its breadth, had slowly become its weakness. Sony Electronics built hardware. Sony Music protected copyrights. Sony Pictures feared piracy. Each division optimized its own kingdom, its own incentives, its own risks. Decisions required committees. Committees required compromise. Compromise slowly replaced clarity. No one truly owned the full user experience from beginning to end, and no one had the authority to force alignment across the company. Sony should have built the iPod. They had the Walkman legacy. They had world-class industrial design. They owned music labels. They understood portable music better than anyone on earth. But internal fear froze them. Closed formats, aggressive digital rights management, endless internal negotiations about control, ownership, and revenue splits. Every decision tried to protect the past instead of enabling the future. Sony protected music. Apple liberated it. In 2001, Apple released the iPod and then iTunes. One device, one store, one vision. Steve Jobs didn't ask permission from 10 departments. He made a decision and shipped it. It wasn't perfect technology, but it was coherent. It respected the user's time and desire. In that moment, Sony lost the future. This happened before smartphones, before social media, before the iPad even existed. By the time those arrived, Sony was already reacting instead of leading. Around the same time, Sony faced public humiliation. In the early 1990s, Sony was supposed to build a CD-ROM add-on for Nintendo's Super Nintendo. The partnership was real. The work was underway. Then Nintendo walked away, publicly, choosing Philips instead. Sony executives were embarrassed on a global stage. For a company built on pride and craftsmanship, the insult cut deep. Many inside Sony wanted to retreat and stay safely within familiar territory, but a small internal group refused. The PlayStation was born from rebellion, from engineers who ignored Sony's hierarchy and focused on one thing: experience. They prioritized software over raw hardware specifications. They courted developers instead of controlling them. They simplified tools and reduced friction. In doing so, they broke many of Sony's old rules. And it worked. PlayStation didn't just succeed, it dominated. It turned gaming into a mainstream cultural force and built one of the strongest entertainment ecosystems in the world. Ironically, Sony saved itself by becoming less like Sony. PlayStation stabilized the company financially and became its backbone. But it remained a kingdom of its own, not a template for the rest of the organization. Phones stayed fragmented, music stayed defensive, televisions stayed hardware first. The lessons of PlayStation never fully spread. Sony learned the future and locked it inside one division. Sony didn't fail, they survived, but survival slowly replaced leadership. They stopped defining what came next. In hindsight, Sony's story reads less like a collapse and more like a quiet warning. Innovation alone isn't enough. Taste isn't enough. Even emotional intelligence isn't enough. What matters, in the end, is whether a company can keep its vision aligned as it scales, and whether it can choose a single future instead of protecting many paths. Sony's tragedy isn't a lack of innovation, it's misalignment. They understood emotion before anyone else, but couldn't unify when systems replaced devices. They invented personal technology. Apple turned it into a way of life. Sony didn't lose because it lacked vision. They lost because vision stopped flowing in one direction. Next time on the Founder Files, we'll look at Reed Hastings and Netflix, and how one decision turned a DVD by mail company into the blueprint for modern streaming. Now I want to hear from you. Which founder, company, or rise and fall story should we cover next? Drop your ideas in the comments, and it might just become the next episode of The Founder Files.